The next session is chaired by Professor Rachel Ruth from Princeton University.
Good morning. Welcome to the second session of the morning, which has the wonderful title Science and Predation in Australia and America. We'll hear, as with the last session, from two speakers, Dr. Ruth Pullin and Dr. Kenneth Haltman, and we will have a question and answer session after each talk. Let me remind you once again that these proceedings are being recorded. And when we get to the question and answer sessions, if you could please wait for the microphone to come before you ask your question. And I will, as Richard did, remind you to flip off any device that you have that might beep, buzz, or ring. Thank you. So our first speaker, Dr. Ruth Pullin, is an art historian and a curator. Her home base is Melbourne, where she is a continuing fellow at the State Library of Victoria, working, among other things, on the library's collection of Eugène von Gerhard drawings, most of which were created during his first 3 years in Australia, 1852 to 1855. As a von Gerhard specialist, Dr. Pullin co-created the National Gallery of Victoria's 2011 major touring exhibition, Eugène von Gerhard, Nature Revealed, which was accompanied by a major publication of the same title, for which she served as the commissioning editor and also as an author. She has published her research in a variety of distinguished journals, and her book, entitled The Artist as Traveler, Eugène von Gerhard's Sketchbooks, will appear in 2018. Today, she will speak to us on the Dusseldorf effect in the landscapes of the New World, 19th century science, contemporary environmental relevance. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Pullin.
Thank you. Have I got the little pointer? Oh yes, here it is. Got the little pointer. Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here and really a privilege, and thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me to be part of this symposium. Now, the exhibition Continental Shift brings together paintings from two continents, from Australia and from America. And I want to introduce a third geographical site, and that is Dusseldorf. And I want to have a look at the role that Dusseldorf played in the formation of the artists. And in this particular exhibition, the four artists I'll be considering are Gifford, Sanford Robertson Gifford, William Stanley Hazeltine, Worthington Whitredge, and Eugène von Gerhard, each of whom spent time in Dusseldorf. And I think that time in Dusseldorf was really formative. Now, of course, the American connection, the transatlantic link between America and Dusseldorf has been pretty well documented, most recently in a major exhibition in Dusseldorf, 2011 Dusseldorf School of Painting and its international influence. But over, I suppose, the past 150 years, the meaning of Dusseldorf for these artists has shifted and changed. During the artists' own lifetimes, Dusseldorf, well, I suppose in the middle of the century, Dusseldorf was seen as a really key place for American artists to go and study. But by 1864, already one American art critic could describe the influence of Dusseldorf as an infection, and something which the very best painters shook off. And I think that's probably partly to do with what was happening in America, and it parallels what was happening here, that need in the New World to establish a national style of painting. Certainly, Dusseldorf is mentioned in the literature for the American artists, but often only in passing. Even Barbara Novak dismisses it a little bit. She says, well, she thinks the Dusseldorf influence has been a little bit overstressed and looks more to people like Caspar David Friedrich as being important for the formation of the American School of Painting. Even so, it's been understood and documented. Not so for the Australian, or the artist who worked in Australia, Eugene von Gerard, who was basically forgotten in what became his hometown, Dusseldorf, from the time he left in 1852. He returned briefly in 1882, but he really hasn't been part of the canon of the Dusseldorf School until very recently, with the 2011 exhibition, Bettina Baumgartel's, we have our dazzling figure recognised in Dusseldorf. Unfortunately, they'd hoped to borrow some of von Gerard's paintings for the show, which would have been a first, but we were running our own exhibition in Melbourne at that time, Eugene von Gerard Nature Revealed, but it suggests a shift. So the time that these four artists spent in Dusseldorf shaped how they saw, understood and portrayed nature. And just as a little corrective, I'm going to just let you look at this image, because the way the Dusseldorf School has been characterised, very much seen even from the time of that 1864 critic, as a hard style, as a style of painting that gave emphasis to drawing over colour, very academic, very thorough, but a fairly cold style. But look at this. This is von Gerard painting in Dusseldorf in 1841. This beautiful, fresh, light, airy study painted directly from nature. And this is the theme I want to pursue in this talk, is just to look at what really was going on in Dusseldorf and what actually these artists took from their experience there. So in the 1840s and 50s, the practice of landscape painting grew in Dusseldorf, informed by the transformations and the understanding of the natural world that were taking place, notably, or wrought most notably by the great German natural scientist and polymath, Alexander von Humboldt. And I think he's very important for the theme of the symposium because, of course, Humboldt's vision of nature was revolutionary. He spoke about ecology, even though the term ecology had not yet been coined. He understood, he really had a vision of nature in which he saw every element of the natural world as being part of an interrelated whole. And if you plucked one little thread of that web, that would have repercussions right throughout the environment. So he was bringing that quite new vision of the natural world to popular awareness through his literature, but also in his writing and the writings of others like Carl Gustav Carus, a landscape painter, art theorist and scientist. They both argued for the role of science for the future of landscape painting. So they both argued very much that the artist should be the scientist, that art and science worked side by side, that the artist needed to understand the geological formation and structures of the earth, the cloud formations, botany and so on. And so that was very much the environment these artists were working in Dusseldorf. And the legacy of that Dusseldorf experience, I think when we look at the American paintings and the Australian works of von Gerard, are works that are scientifically informed and that actually embedded in them we can find information about the environment as it was then. They're embedded with information of contemporary environmental relevance. So, Dusseldorf. I've said some of these things. This is what I tend to do. I have my notes and then I start chatting. Yeah, so the Dusseldorf School, as I was saying, being characterised as a hard academic dry school in which colour is privileged over, drawing privileged over colour. But I think this is very much a reductive, monodimensional view that misrepresents what Dusseldorf meant to the landscape painters. And so what I want to look at is why they actually went there. Now, for the Americans, there were certain structures in place. Leutzer had arrived German-born Leutzer had arrived in Dusseldorf in 1841, and he was something of a trailblazer for the many artists who followed, the many Americans who'd followed. But there are other links that formed. In 1849, the Dusseldorf Gallery opened in New York. It was opened by John Godfrey Boker, who'd been a consul in the Rhineland, and recognised the popularity of the Dusseldorf School of Painters with collectors. And there was a strong cohort of collectors, particularly in Cincinnati, and with a particular interest in the works of Carl Friedrich Lessing and Andreas Achenbach. So by 1851, George Hall, American landscape painter, could describe Dusseldorf as decidedly the best place in Europe for a landscape artist to study in. And certainly Americans were going and travelling in Italy, they were going to France, but Dusseldorf took precedence at this time. And Dusseldorf, at that time, the 1840s and 50s, had generally a growing international reputation. Artists were flocking there from throughout Germany, from Scandinavia, particularly Norway, Russia, Belgium, France, the Baltic states. It was really an international centre. Von Gerard arrived there by different means. He was born in Vienna and had travelled in Italy for 12 years with his father. In 1838, he headed north to Dusseldorf following the death of his father in Naples, partly because he had family connections there, but also he knew about Dusseldorf. He'd met some of the artists there in Rome in 1830 when the then director had taken a group of his Dusseldorf students to Rome, so he knew this was the place for landscape painting. Now, what was it about the Academy that was so interesting? Oh, here's the Academy, painted by Andreas Achenbach in 1831, the old Academy in Dusseldorf. Along with the very high academic standards and thorough training, which were really obviously part of the Dusseldorf attraction, its director, Wilhelm von Schadow, he was director from 1825 to 1859, encouraged a spirit of community, of brotherhood among the students. And this was an attitude that flowed out into the wider academy, beyond the walls of the academy, into the community. And Schadow also introduced a progressive teaching model. It was based on his experiences with the Nazarenes in Rome. And it was a kind of an atelier, a master-student relationship where students would have their very thorough 3 years of training, but then would go into their own atelier and have a private master-student relationship. So this sense of collaboration and sense of respect, I think that's one thing that the artists really enjoyed, and in fact we can see reverberations of it in the 10th Street studio in New York. Although Schadow privileged history painting and portraiture over a genre and landscape, it was really genre and landscape painting that flourished, and they were the areas for which the school became known. From 1839, Johann Wilhelm Schirmer was the professor of landscape painting, and von Gerard studied under Schirmer for 4 years. He was enrolled from 1840 to 44. I've just not keeping up with my images. This just gives a sense of that brotherly quality. There are so many portraits of artists, formal portraits like this, also informal caricatures and so on, that give this sense of the bonding that was part of the Dusseldorf experience. And this is obviously the bottom one's taken from a book, but it's a group of 57 portraits painted by Friedrich Boser, and von Gerard is number 14. So there he is. So von Gerard was studied for 4 years before going into his own atelier, and he painted this lovely little cloud study from the window of his atelier in the Dusseldorf Academy. None of the 3 Americans we're looking at actually studied at the Academy. They went to Dusseldorf, but they were not formally enrolled. However, they still were part of that Dusseldorf experience. And while they weren't members of the Academy, they were members of another extremely important organisation, the Künstlerverein Malkasten. And Malkasten, this artists' association, formed on the evening of the 6th of August, 1848, following a demonstration for national unity. Remember, 1848, it's a very sort of volatile time. And the artists were very involved with this movement, and here Leutzer was involved with producing some of the staging for the demonstration, and here we can see the statue of the figure of Germania. That evening, the artists went back, formed their own association, Malkasten. Von Gerard was one of the founding members, and each of our American artists were members while they were there. Whitredge was in Dusseldorf from 1849 to 56, so nearly 7 years. Hazeltine from 1855 to 57, and Gifford in 1856. And Gifford, well, here we can see von Gerard as one of the founders. There's the portrait of von Gerard in 1848 as the founder of Malkasten. But Gifford describes what the atmosphere at this club must have been like and how important it was to the social and artistic fabric of the city. He says, "There is a theatre belonging where comical plays and operas, composed and conducted by the artists, are performed. It's a place where they congregate in the evening to sup, smoke, talk, drink beer, play billiards, and amuse themselves in various ways." And the American influence is very much there. Euchre, one of Leutzer's American introductions, is a favourite game of cards. Artists of all merit, grades or merit, meet here and in perfect and genial social company. A true brotherhood seems to reign among them. And for Whitredge, this was where he could come into contact with some of the leading figures like Achenbach and Lessing. He remembered that at the Malkasten he could meet and listen to the greats like Andreas Achenbach, and that he could have learned just as much about painting if he had never met them anywhere else but at the club. Now that sense of artist associations and artist communities permeated even more deeply. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just to touch on one other. Just isn't this wonderful? Can you see Whitredge? There he is. Whitredge and Leutzer are the two that we can recognise. Yeah, so the artists formed small composition societies. Following a model established by Lessing and Schirmer in 1827, they formed little landscape composition societies where the artists, probably groups of, perhaps between 8 to 10 to 12 artists would meet on a fortnightly basis. They'd bring along a composition for discussion and critique, but they might also talk about the compositions of one of the great 17th century, a Claude Lorraine or a Dutch landscape, and they talked about poetry, they talked about art theory. And in this sketchbook of von Gerard's shows him working in very much that way. This is a sketchbook that he kept between 1847 and 51, a sketchbook of compositions. They're drawn on winter evenings. So they're compositions drawn from memory. And he says many were drawn in Tonescau's house. Tonescau, we know, or pretty sure, was the affectionate name he gave to his fiancée, Louise Arnz. Louise Arnz was the daughter of Heinrich Arnz, who ran the very important lithographic firm in Dusseldorf, and it reveals to us that von Gerard was absolutely entrenched in Dusseldorf society and the art world, because two of Louise's brothers were artists, Albert and Otto Arnz. 3 of the brothers-in-law, including Oswald Achenbach, were artists. So there he had very close associations, along with all the friendships he formed in the academy. It wasn't quite so easy for the Americans. For Whitredge, it was through his activities as a dealer for the collectors in Cincinnati, notably Joseph Longworth and Mr. W. Scarborough, that he was able to make contact with the senior painters in the school. He says, "As I was a picture buyer in Dusseldorf as well as a student, it was easier for me to obtain entrance into the best families of the place. I became intimate with Lessing and Mrs. Lessing." And we can see the results here, where Whitredge has travelled with Lessing on 2 expeditions to the Harz region, really important centre for artists, not just the Dusseldorf painters, but the painters coming from Dresden, Friedrich and so on would go and paint there. It's, of course, the site of the great Heinrich Heine's Harzreise poem. But look at that connection. Both painted in 1853, the landscapes of the Harz. Now, an essential aspect of landscape painting in Dusseldorf is what we looked at the very beginning, that lovely little oil study of Eckrath. In the 1840s and 50s, there was an emphasis on painting directly from nature, and it was integral to Schirmer's painting, to Schirmer's teaching program. He led expeditions into the Grafenberg woods, which are just about an hour out of Dusseldorf, into the Neander Valley, about 12 kilometres from Dusseldorf, in a really spectacular countryside where the bones of Neanderthal man were subsequently found. The artist went there before any of that history was known and painted this extraordinary landscape of caves and deep ravines and rivers and so on. Here we can see Schirmer, and you might be able to pick out the artist. This is very typical of the Dusseldorf painter. It's crouched down at ground level, absorbing the details of nature, looking at the flow of water over the rocks. And this is, I think, is very much part of a Humboldtian mindset, that you wanted to understand exactly the type of plants that grew at the banks of the river, of the water's edge, or how water flowed. Really an intimate engagement with nature. Here are von Gerard's 2 studies that he painted in the Neander Valley, Das Gesteins, it was known as the artist, the stones. And these studies, of course, they weren't finished works of art. They were made as studies to be taken back to the studio as points of reference, but also just in terms of imprinting that quality of that part of the natural world in the artist's imagination. And I think, when we start to look at von Gerard, one thing that people always ask me is, how could he remember the things that he painted back in the studio? Well, of course he made sketches, but I think he had an extraordinary memory. And a lot of that memory sort of goes back to the training here. So here again in Dusseldorf. Now, the influence of Dusseldorf on our 4 artists in this exhibition, I'm just going to touch very briefly on Gifford and Whitredge. I think there are so many ways that we can see that influence permeating through these works. I'm going to focus on one, but just by way of touching on the others, here looking at Gifford's work, and this is something that standard view of the hard, dry style wouldn't accommodate. I think when we look at the elegiac mood of Gifford's Hunter Mountain Twilight, evoked really, I suppose it's the time of day, twilight, the end of the day, it's the intensity of colour, it's the light, it's the atmospheric veil. All of these follow very much in the tradition of the Dusseldorf Stimmungsbilder, mood pictures. The artists were concerned with poetry. There are many works where it will be just an evening landscape, a twilight, a stormy landscape. So it's the mood of a landscape. There's much more that could be said about this Gifford, and that I'd like to say, is that elegiac mood connected with the land clearing that's gone on, devastation of the trees for the tannery that was built? We don't know, but I won't get lost with that. So colour, and look at Andreas Achenbach here, an evening landscape and that intensity of colour. Similarly with Whitredge, this very beautiful work, Indian Encampment, I think what he's drawing from Dusseldorf here is much more an attitude. It's a concern with capturing the character of a place. And this was a real emphasis for the artists going into the Eiffel. Artists were assessed on their ability to capture the character of the Eiffel. They do lots and lots of studies. And I think here you do get that sense that it's not a big, grandiose landscape. It's very accurate, but it does convey something of the actual character of that place. Now, the focus of the talk is, or the point of contact, I suppose I want to focus on, is that of geology and the importance of geology for these two artists, obviously Hazeltine and von Gerard, but how that grew out of their practice in Dusseldorf. So to begin with, we're going to look at Schirmer. The momentous advances being made in the field of geology in the early 19th century had a very direct and obvious relevance for landscape painting, and it was one that the Dusseldorf painters understood very early. The volcanic Eifel region, where research into volcanic phenomena was taking place, there are 74 Maar volcanoes there, and 8 of them are lake-filled, a bit like the lake-filled volcanoes that von Gerard found in the Western District of Victoria. But this Eifel region, this important region for research, was pretty much on Dusseldorf's doorstep. It's south of Dusseldorf, between Cologne and Trier, to the west of the Rhine River. And scientists, including Alexander von Humboldt and the great geologist Leopold von Buch, had started to trek into the Eifel on their field trips in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By 1822, textbooks and research was being published, including Jacob von Nogerith's 4-volume collection of essays on the Eifel. The painters followed in the footsteps of the scientists. And in 1831, Schirmer led the first group of his students on a sketching expedition into the Eifel, and it was the beginning of a really key aspect of the Dusseldorf landscape painters' training. So by the 1840s, a student's ability to capture the Eifel was really, that was how they were assessed. If you look at the teachers' assessments, captured the Eifel well, successful handling of the Eifel. So it was very important. Now, Schirmer made multiple trips into the region, but it was really Carl Friedrich Lessing who took it on. He made 7 trips to the Eifel, and he filled his sketchbooks with precise, accurate, and most importantly, scientifically informed studies of rocks, cliffs, craters, crater lakes, and travelled with Nogerith's very heavy text with him. This is a plate from 1 volume of the text, and it's almost like a map leading the artist to the significant sites. Von Gerard made his journey into the Eifel with a companion, Georg Saal, in August 1843. And I hope you can see these. This is just 2 pages of 13 series of these very precise rock studies. Carus, the painter and theorist, in his 9 letters on landscape painting, argued that the accurate study of rocks was essential to the landscape painter as anatomical studies were to the history or figure painter. And here we can see von Gerard really engaging with the rocks, using his pencil to hack out the shadows and the crevasses, and you can see where layers of rocks are about to shear off. As for Lessing, it seemed that von Gerard sought to have the structure of the rock so impressed on his memory that each piece he drew later in the studio was like a study taken from nature. Now, Richard has talked a little bit about Hazeltine's painting, so he's actually, I'm going to make up a bit of time here, so that's good. But as you can see, Hazeltine's The Rocks at Nahant, 1864. It's one of more than 16 works that Hazeltine painted of this subject, so he was clearly fascinated by these rocks on the little peninsula 15 miles north of Boston. Rebecca Bedell, in her book The Anatomy of Nature, suggests that to understand why he placed so much stress on the rock formations, we need to look at both the social history of the site but also the teachings of the great Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz. I think we also need to look back to Dusseldorf, to the experience of the Eifel and the Harz, and to the examples of Lessing and Schirmer. Now, the presence of Agassiz in Boston, of course, was critical for Hazeltine. He studied there, he gave lectures. We don't know if Hazeltine was actually a student, but he certainly would have attended the hugely popular lectures that Richard mentioned earlier. And, of course, Agassiz, as you know, the peninsula became an outdoor research laboratory, and he gave lectures there. What he must have been so excited about was seeing these rocks that gave evidence of glacial activity, the very field in which he'd made his most important contributions in his European career. So he's seeing almost the way in which Humboldt did also, that there were parallels or correlations across the globe. So, it's a very nice idea, and again, picking up on what Richard said, here we have our artists in the New World, but in fact, they're looking at an ancient geological world. For Hazeltine, later on, he wrote about the scientific objectives. Every real artist, he said, is also a scientist. And an artist, like a scientist, is not satisfied until his work is a true expression of what he feels to be real. And we can see the way he's gone into such detail to give the sense of the shearing and cutting action of the glaciers. So, of course, that geological heritage, I think, can be traced, or certainly made Hazeltine very open, very aware, prepared to see what Agassiz was talking about, because he'd had that preparation in Dusseldorf. But there are other links with the Dusseldorf school. While the penetrating focus that Lessing brought to his studies of rocks in the Eifel and the Harz stood as a powerful model for Hazeltine's response to the rocks at Nahant, we can look also to a work like, or perhaps just before I go to that, just notice when you look at this work, the way, we've got the little fisherman down here, we've got the coastal subject, but the subject is the rocks. The rocks are here delineated in crystal clear, sharp focus. Over here, much more atmospheric. But the subject is the rocks. But in some ways, some writers have talked about a slight dislocation between those two aspects of the work. And if we look here at Schirmer, this is something that was very much part of Schirmer's practice. We can see, the artist here with his paint box and so on, painting a close-range study of nature. And what Schirmer often did was he took these little sections, Partien, little studies that would become integrated into a larger composition. And there is that kind of division here between those two sections of the work. I haven't met... I won't go to a bit. I'll just keep on. Also, was it possible that Hazeltine had seen these little studies by Schirmer, studies painted in 1836 of the rocks on the coast near Etretat? And there are quite a series of them. Although they were mainly kept in his studio, they were shown at the Academy, and outside artists could come and see them. And of course, Schirmer stood as a great model for all the artists who came through the Dusseldorf school. Von Gerard, the subject of von Gerard's Mount William from Mount Dryden is the Grampians Garryword Range, and like Nahant, it was, for Hazeltine, it was also a subject to which he returned many times. This range, located in northwestern Victoria, consists of 3 ridges. I'll just show you where it's located for the people who don't know the region. It's in Victoria, just down here, and it's a ridge. It's a band of 3 ridges, up-thrust sandstone ridges that run in a north-northwesterly band for about 90 kilometres, and they rise spectacularly from flat basalt plains. In von Gerard's painting, it's the mountains. How are we going?
We're at 30.
Oh, we're at 30? I haven't said my main things. Oh, I've been doing it too. All right, I won't read the notes. I'll just go through and just tell you what I was going to say. So, von Gerard, the sketches. So von Gerard first saw the Grampians in 1855, returned in 1856 for this long expedition where he travelled along the length of the Grampians. And I think that's important. It goes back to one of Richard's points, the idea of living in, being in the landscape. Von Gerard trekked along that landscape, he camped, there I was just going to make the connection with Schirmer and this lovely clear skyline. But in his sketchbooks, he recorded what he saw, engage with the landscape, and particularly the details, the bird life here in the water areas. But just coming back to the main picture, when we stand here and look at this view, you can see these little pockets, these shallow lakes here. You won't see those today. They've pretty much been drained by settlers. Further south they still exist, but not so much here. But I think the key thing we want to get to conclude, is the ecological ramifications for what von Gerard has painted here. And I don't know if you can see, but right in the very foreground there's an animal that's actually a dingo. I used to think it was a fox. Foxes weren't there. It's a dingo, and he looks like he's our predator coming in to attack the game. Now, one of the senior rangers from the Grampians Garryword National Park sees this painting as telling a really important story about the loss of high-level predation and the cascading effect that has had on the environment. Because there you look out and you see these areas of grassland, and again we've got to think of Bill Gammage and the idea of this land having been managed by the Jawajali people, burned off to make fresh pick for the game. But today, if you looked at those lakes and this grassland, you'd find that understory is now full of hard shrubs, wood. In fact, I can show you a bit of a painting. I mean, that's the view of what it looks like. But there's a lot of other material that's come into the landscape. So to me, it recalls Eric Rolls in A Million Wild Acres. We talk about wilderness and colonisation as if they're opposites, but in fact here, wilderness, the encroachment of the logs and the shrubs and the bushes and the other species, wilderness in some ways is a factor of colonisation. It's actually created by the fact that the land clearing has been done, that we have now the predator, the dingo, no longer attacking, no longer there. So the kangaroos have taken over, they've eaten out all that grass, and the other species that they don't like so much have taken over. So it's a very, very different view. In 1870, when defending his art against the sins of microscopism levelled at him by James Smith, the art critic, von Gerard maintained that his work would have greater value for the future. And I think it seems that he was right, because we can go back and see what that landscape looked like only 20 years into settlement. My apologies. I tried to relax and chat. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you. We have a time for a couple of questions. So, Richard.
That was absolutely lovely to listen to. I wish you could have gone on. But
I would have liked it.
I know. That was lovely. I think one of the advantages of your approach is that it suspends, to some extent, the necessity to talk about Australia and American artists in nationalist terms, because you're looking at a common source in Dusseldorf training. And then it would be interesting to pursue what their separate destinations did to their training when they went to different places. The question I want to pose is rather about the kinds of training they got, and the possibility of a sense of rivalry with science as well as learning from it. And this is not actually what you talked about a great deal in your paper, but the chart that you showed by Nogarath,
Yes.
I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but there is the sense of Gerard and others striving to understand the way in which these scientists grasped the landscape with their intellects. Now, on that chart, there were various indications of what is happening underneath the Earth, and I to what extent Gerard and others chose subjects that allowed for the expression of those inner forces, whether their selection of landscape features were ever made in a sense of conscious rivalry for what confinement merely to the surface of a landscape cannot achieve. I just wondered whether, particularly these sorts of aerial views, show those kinds of inner under features.
I think you're absolutely, I'll answer over here. Absolutely right. I think the artists, I wouldn't say that they were rival, they weren't rivaling the scientists. I think there was very much, I mean, it grows out of the 18th century, that sense of the scientist, the artist travelling on scientific expeditions and so on, working side by side. But certainly that sense of the underlying workings of the landscape, and had I managed my time a little better, I would have talked about that here, because Carus, in advising artists, but being a scientist himself, says if you look closely enough at the external forms, you will understand the internal processes. And I think von Gerard was very, very conscious of that, and that's one of the reasons that this subject would have appealed to him so much. He was interested in the idea of uplift. He was probably aware that this had been an old sea coast, and in fact the German geologist Ferdinand von Hochstetter had come to Melbourne in 1859, met von Gerard, and he'd gone out into the Western District and described this as like an old sea coast. So even then they had that awareness. And certainly von Gerard, I mean, he obviously understands rocks. In his sketchbooks he tells us whether it's basalt or it's granite or whatever. But I think that there is that desire to understand the deep forces beneath the earth as part of the painting.
I think we have time for one more.
And it's just a very small one. In that marvellous caricature of the Yankees playing pool,
Yes.
above the scene of the pool table, there are what look like two caricatures. Is that Leutzer on the right above? Because he's in the form of a turkey, which is a North American animal. I wonder whether that might be...
Well, probably is. And the sketchbooks, even von Gerard's sketchbooks, have images like that, and not only by him, by other artists who would have come in. He would have had his Italian sketchbooks in the studio, someone else comes and does a drawing of Gouda or somebody else, and some of them are those heads with ram's horns or a turkey or whatever, so they seem to have names for each other, and you know, they were caricatures.
And
yes.
emblematizing the American
That's
in
right.
relation to his
Exactly.
fauna.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.